It's on.
Yep. Welcome, everyone. My name is John Kodrowski with Claude Lawrenson. We work with FNNBOA. I'm the project manager since the beginning of the association. Claude works as an independent and has been working with FNNBOA for the past several years on various topics and giving many of our webinars. So today we want to give a webinar on tenants' responsibilities, including home maintenance and repairs for the unit. Okay. So we have the objectives today are important documentations and processes before you move into the unit, highlight some of the responsibilities of the council and the tenant, and some maintenance repairs expected by the tenant. This webinar is for many Indigenous communities, so the items we identified in the webinar may not necessarily be the same in your community. We have identified what we can call the best practice or standards that should be followed by everyone involved, especially for tenants. So before moving into a unit, there are key documents that you should have. You should have a signed lease that clearly states the roles and responsibilities between the chief and council and the tenant, who is responsible to clean and replace furnace air filters and replace light bulbs, how to report maintenance issues, dispose of the garbage. There should also be one rent or occupancy payment, who and when those payments are going to be made. Generally, they're first of each month. Now, I know rent and occupancy fee may be an issue for some communities because some believe rent housing is a treaty right, but there are no references in many of the treaties that suggest housing is a treaty right, and therefore there may be an oral basis for a knowledge or promises or some type of evidence, but that has never ever been brought forward. So the idea of housing as a treaty right is really more of a rumor and speculation. It's not a reality. But at the end of the day, housing is not free. Somebody has to pay for it, and it's generally the people accommodating or living in the homes have to cover their cost. The third thing you want to do is a walk around inside and outside, take photos of the units. Pictures should be dated, and print the pictures and store them in a safe place, or if you have them on your camera, move them onto a USB key. You should also have a complete move-in and a move-out checklist. So before moving into the unit, key deposits may be required. This is to replace the key if they're lost, especially if you have key or fobs or remotes. They're extremely expensive, a few $100s. You need to set up your utilities, who's going to be billed in terms of your heat, your hydro. It is highly suggested, and in some communities, it's mandatory that the purchaser have to purchase renter or occupancy insurance. So here you're going to have to call a local insurance. Generally, if you have a car, you would contact the people who you have your car insurance with to also look at occupancy insurance. And consider the purchase of a toolkit such as a hammer or a multi-screwdriver or some pliers or tape measures. You can get these home repair kits for around $30 on Amazon or a Canadian Tire on their sales. Okay. So responsibilities for the maintenance and repairs of the property. So let's look at the chief and councils. Well, the chief and council, which they're also the landlord under provincial legislation, their responsibilities are keep the rental property in good state of repair, keep it in good working order. This includes the electrical, the plumbing, the heating systems, the appliances are working, carpets in the units or common areas are clean, you're not tripping over them. Walls and roofs and ceilings are repaired and properly maintained. Windows, doors, locks, and lighting generally on the outside of the buildings, and collect rent or any property fees that are in turn used to pay for repairs. So what happens here is a tenant should not withhold any part of rent, even if the tenant feels the maintenance is poor or necessarily or repairs aren't being done. They can easily evict a tenant for not making a payment on time. So that's they can enforce that property payment rule very quickly. Other responsibilities, if no longer works due to normal wear or tear, the wear outs, the chief and council, they must repair it and make sure it's or replace it. Does not need to supply a new or better model. So if you have a stove, doesn't mean you're going to get a brand new stove. They can get a used one from a few years ago and put it in place. They're responsible for control pests such as cockroaches and mice. Follow any bylaws for the upkeep and maintenance of the rental property, must give written notice at least 24 hours in advance before they enter the unit, and they're not required to supply appliances to the units. Responsibilities of maintenance, repairs to the properties, here we go for the tenants. Keep the property units clean, responsible for the ordinary cleanliness, inform the landlord of any needed repairs. To do this, you should do it in writing, so at least there's a paper trail. Repair any damage they cause to the property and make small repairs, for example, changing light bulbs or units, changing wash or filters, or unplugged drains. It's the responsibility of the tenants. Okay. A tenant may be evicted if the tenant or a guest or other persons live in their rental unit, they cause damage to the rental units, or the tenant does not repair or replace the damages done, or they have to pay for it, willfully cause damage to the unit or the building, use of the rental property for something other than a residential use that could cause serious damage. So for example, if a tenant makes the structural changes, electric changes to the unit, in some cases, if you're running a hairdressing out of a residential, you may need permission to do that, or for growing hydroponic vegetables. And what's happened with hydroponic growth is it causes lots of moisture, and moisture leads to mold. So a tenant review checklist, keep this in mind. These are all the responsibilities that the tenant is responsible for. Again, just take a few seconds and read these points, but they range from unit cleaning and ready to move in to outside the attached structures the outside attached structures seems to be solid. So there's a patio, is it properly attached, or is it going to fall down under your occupancy? Make sure the lights are working, the heat's working, the plumbing's working, flush the toilets, run the taps. So these are the checklists you should have before walking in to make sure everything's done. Screens on the windows, do they need repairing? Very important, because the checklist is valuable to make sure you know the conditions before moving in. Okay. So maintenance requirements, cleaning. When it comes to cleaning, there are a number of things that must be considered, such as, use of general household cleaning, appliances, periodic required cleaning. Does the cleaning also require snow removal? So your contract, your leasing arrangement should determine whether or not that's your responsibility on your property. Kitchen, bathrooms, and laundry rooms are common hotspots for bugs because of moistures. And what about garbage or any waste? So if you have waste piled on your property outside, such as a couch, who is responsible to have that removed? And generally, it would be the tenant, and the landlord or the council can come and remove that, but charge you for that removal. Engaging the household occupants before is certainly important to make sure that you know what tasks are required. So some of the cleaning units, some products are magic erasers. They remove impossible stains. So actually, the magic eraser is actually a fantastic, clean everything from shoes to scuffs off of floors, off of walls. It really is terrific. You should have a broom, a mop, scrub brush, a pail, and also the pail after you finish using it, it should be cleaned out so all the oil grime doesn't stay in the bucket. Suggest a scraper tool, bleach. It's a good ingredient for disinfectants, but be careful. You don't want to splash it on. All of a sudden, then you're wearing that 1970 tie-dye shirt. Window cleaner, disinfectant soap, or multi-surface cleaners. Clorox mix surface plus bleach is really a fantastic product. And why do we clean the unit? Well, you clean up the spills immediately. You don't want to leave pet waste or food out for 24 hours a day. You want to clean the dark and damp areas close to food sources, so under and behind the appliances. You should periodically roll out the fridge once or twice a year, or try to, get underneath the stove. Store garbage in sealed plastic containers and dispose of it daily in a can that also has a lid on it. Do not allow any dirty dishes to pile up, and vacuum sweep often to remove food particles, because in fact you're trying to not invite uninvited guests such as rodents and bugs. A few general requirements before required. The lease should say you got to keep the unit clean, keep the unit free of sanitary hazards, keep the unit free of safety hazards. So propane tanks shouldn't be stored inside. They should be stored away from the house. Comply with required building and housing codes and bylaw rules. Again, if couches on front lawns or abandoned vehicles, if you have bylaws in the community, it's up to the tenant to make sure that they are not hanging around. Prevent mold growth, so cleaning bathrooms, make sure your bathroom fans are working. If your bathroom fan does not work, it's really important to call the housing department, get that fixed, because that's essential. Or hood fans in your kitchen. Treat property with care. You are not to damage the property. You are tenants and you do not own the property. And if you damage it, you are responsible for repairs. And evidence of illegal activity can generally lead to an eviction, depending on your community's bylaws. So if your family or family members involved in illegal activity, they can move quickly to evict you out of the house, the whole entire family. So that these are scenes that you want to try to avoid. The pictures speak for themselves. But you can see, so other things to consider: a tenant must repair or pay for the repairs of any damage to the rental property. This is not due to normal wear and tear. The damage could have often caused by the tenant, their guests, or other persons living in the unit. So if you have friends over, they decide to put their hand through the door to show how strong and stupid they are, then you are responsible to replace or repair that door. Tenants are not responsible for reasonable wear and tear from normal usage over time. So if the door handle over time breaks, that would be a normal wear and tear. On the other side, let review the key property components that required other care and considerations. So I'm going to turn that over to Claude to talk about some of those repairs. But finally, before I turn over to Claude, you have tenancy papers, you have a rental agreement, you have pictures of before you moved in, you have the pre-check. It's important to keep those documents in a safe place. And so either you keep them in, if you have a filing cabinet, or you put it in the cabinet or the cupboard over the fridge in a folder or in a brown paper folder, because you need to keep, those are legal documents, and it is important to have those available all the time. So I will now turn it over to Claude.
Thank you, John. Okay, one of the key things we really need to know is where to find the main shutoffs. So do you actually know where the main shutoffs are located? Certainly, in case of emergency, if there's a malfunction, or certain types of maintenance that may be required, will require you to shut off certain items. So as we can see here, these could include electrical, gas, oil, or propane, certainly fuel type services, or simply water and/or plumbing. So again, when we start taking a look at the electrical, we can see here houses generally have electrical distribution, or in this case, this is a breaker panel, and sometimes it will be a fuse type panel. But I've tried to point out here, most have this main breaker. So up towards the top, there is a main breaker, and actually the arrow should be a little higher up to that darkened area on that electrical panel. And each circuit has its own breaker. So for example, let's say for a living or bedroom space, it will likely be hopefully labeled, and the breaker will be either hopefully in the on position, or if requiring a service, switched over back to the off position. So flipping the main breaker switch into the off position typically will shut off all the electrical power when it comes to the main breaker. And if it's just individual circuits, then we can do it by flipping one of those blue or whitish gray type breaker switches. Certainly, I also like to warn that electrical repairs must be done by a licensed qualified electrician. Again, electrical can be a serious and certainly potentially life-threatening safety hazard. When it comes to things like gas or propane or fuels in general, the main shutoff will be located at the gas meter or perhaps at the propane tank. So we can see here in this particular, again, images that there are these yellow handled, we'll call it switches for the shutoff. So in this particular upper photograph, we can see that the handle is in line with the piping, which means there's a flow through, so it's currently on. Now, if it's 90 degrees to the piping, that will be in the shutoff position. So just kind of give you an orientation of that particular shutoff. Again, we're taking a look at some piping behind a appliance, in this case, a stove. So again, I mentioned the 90-degree rule for shutting them off, or should be in line with the piping when it's in the on position. Certainly, each appliance should have a shutoff. But again, as a reminder, if you smell gas, do not light an appliance. Get out of the house for safety, and certainly contact your local utility company or housing authority, and certainly let them know that you are suspect of something that could be potentially dangerous. So again, for fuels. When we start talking about things such as water, typically each house will have a main water shutoff. Again, if we look to the photograph, we can see in this case it has a meter, and just close to it there is a valve type shutoff, which is the main water supply coming into the house. That blue line is really the water line going over towards the water heater. But while we're there, I also would like to talk about in the photograph, for example, where the green arrows, the ones to the left, again, for the gas piping. And again, over to the right of that, we see the electrical service panel. So again, in this particular photograph, we see the combination of all three. So water, gas, and certainly the electrical service. So ideally, each plumbing fixture should have a shutoff. When we talk about this, ideally, plumbing fixture should have a shutoff. Not all houses will have individual shutoffs at the fixtures. So in the lower right photograph, we see an individual shutoff at a kitchen sink area. So typically water would only need to be shut off in cases of an emergency or perhaps during a plumbing repair, such as, let's say, replacing the taps at the sink. I'm going to talk a little bit about windows, and certainly there are many different types of windows, but as a tenant, there's a few things you should check when it comes to windows. Certainly the operability of the window, making sure that it can open or close with reasonableness, and certainly taking a look at the hardware. Can the hardware allow it to open if it's a casement, sort of a crank open type window? Or is it simply a latch which helps seal for a little more security? Again, other things to take a look at is certainly how can we reduce drafts or any air leakage? And that's looking at the weather stripping on a window. What about the condition of the glass? So when we take a look at the condition of the glass, there's a lot of different things that can happen, but over time, the seals, that space between the windows, if it's a thermal pane or double glazed window, there is certainly an opportunity for moisture in the seal to break. So therefore, things such as broken glass, broken springs, and certainly broken seals on a window will eventually cause things to happen that may not be convenient when it comes to windows. If the glass appears to be becoming milky or foggy, as it's indicated, these are simply a sign of the window seal failure. From a perspective, it doesn't have a great amount of energy lost, but certainly it can be cosmetically not so pretty. A little difficult to look out the window when it appears a little bit foggy. But again, when it comes to windows, a few things that the tenant can do is simply use mild soap solution to clean the window glass, and certainly do not use alcohol or ammonia-based cleaners, as they can cause streaking and certainly eventually cause damage to the glass itself. When it comes to window cleaning and care, look at things such as cleaning the sliding tracks when it comes to windows that are sliders. And I would take a look at this several times a year and certainly monthly to make sure that there's no mold buildup. If there's condensation on the windows over time, if that condensation does not evaporate, it can accumulate and become eventually mold. So glass should not be cleaned again with products that contain vinegar or ammonia. Simply use a mild detergent. And certainly it's not just the window itself, it could be the whole window frame. Also keep in mind that window screens should be in good repair, and hopefully, again, the window screens are intended to open the windows in the warmer weather and certainly reduce the opportunity for insects getting into the house. So again, window tracks often collect dust and airborne debris that will require periodic cleaning, as well as the glass window panels. Next, we'll jump over to doors, and we'll talk a little bit about doors. So door maintenance includes possibly replacing the weather stripping. This certainly applies to exterior doors. Things such as even tightening screws, or even simply adding a little bit of oil, lubricating oil, to the hinges so that it operates, or perhaps the door doesn't squeak. And replacing any door stops if required. Now, the door stops are intended so that the doors will, in the closed position, stop at a wood or usually, in some cases, metal type stop, which avoids it from going further past the door frame. So things such as adjusting, repairing interior and closet doors, we'll take a look at that in a moment. But constant usage and wear and tear, doors can experience sagging, loose door handles, and even loose hinge pins. So again, some things to think about with some minor maintenance when it comes to doors. Again, when we start talking about minor door repairs, we can see here in this photograph, this is a pair of bifold doors. And we can see there's a crack, and so damage that has been done over time to the bottom of the door itself. So again, slamming doors, such as a bifold, it's very common for it to split near the top or the bottom, near the pivot pins. So we can take the door down and pry the pivot out of the door edge with a flathead screwdriver or pliers. We can spread the crack slightly with the screwdriver and spread some carpenter glue and some wood filler, or even add a bunch of wood toothpicks. We can close the wood with a C-clamp, or simply a wood clamp, and leave it on for about 3 to 4 hours. And we can tap the pin back in, that's that for that pivot condition, with a hammer and mount the door back on its brackets. If the pin is itself damaged or loose, possibly it may need to be replaced with a new one. When we talk again a little bit about door hardware, a few more things to consider when it comes to maintenance and care. Do not hang heavy objects on door handles. Check knobs and hinges and other hardware for loose screws and simply tighten. Sometimes strip hinge screws can be filled with wood, glue, as I indicated earlier, matchstick, and a little bit of carpenter glue. And again, lubricate the hinges yearly with some silicone-based machine oil. So something like a WD-40. When we come to things such as floors, walls, and ceilings, again, when you're looking at the house initially, consider the types of finishes and the condition of the finishes in particular. So are the materials of the floors, walls, and ceiling, they should be reasonably durable and be readily cleanable if they're not already cleaned or possibly the walls have been repainted. Certainly some regular dusting and washing and cleaning will help in maintaining the finished conditions. And certainly mistreatment of surfaces such as dragging heavy furniture across the floor can often cause damage to the floor and eventually to the material. So eventually the condition may present itself as a trip hazard. And of course, we don't want to see people, falling and getting hurt with trip hazards. Again, unfortunately, over to the right-hand side, we see a couple of, we'll call it sort of horrible conditions when it comes to the finishes in a particular house. So wall damage, missing floor tiles, some loose tiles. And when I look at the one in the lower right, potentially, possibly a trip hazard. And that's just coming through the front door. Another look at this. So as I indicated, there can be walls or ceilings or even floors can be damaged by a number of different events. But when it comes to walls, one of the most common things is certainly hanging pictures on the wall, to the other extreme of causing physical damage caused by creating a hole in the wall. So common materials such as drywall or what's known as gypsum board are often prone to wall damage because they're not very, very hard, but they are presenting a pretty good finish since they tend not to be overly strong simply as a material. Again, even mistreatment of surfaces such as furniture movement against the wall can often cause damage to the finishing material. So again, here in the photograph, we can see some cracks in the ceiling caused by water damage. Possibly in this case, or actually was from a roof leak. So again, there's some repairs are starting to take place in this particular ceiling in the overhead sort of bulkhead of the wall opening. So when it comes to repairing drywall, it actually is a fairly easy process. So minor drywall repairs can be readily completed by simply sanding over the damaged area, which helps scuff and clean it up a bit, fill with drywall compound, and if required, adding a second layer if necessary. And when it's dry, certainly sand, smooth, and apply a primer paint. And certainly a primer paint is required in order to get a good paint finish that will match the remainder of the wall that you're probably going to end up having to possibly repaint. When it comes to something a little bit larger, it requires possibly some crisscross layers of sticky back tape, or perhaps the more traditional paper type tape. But certainly it needs to be filled because there's a little bit of a larger opening. Simply cover with a thin layer of drywall compound. Again, let it dry and sand if necessary. Apply two layers of compound and feather out the edges. When dry, sand and apply a primer paint. Now, to avoid a lot of the sanding, typically what I do when it comes to drywall repairs is I try and I'll put that drywall compound on certainly in nice layers, but I'll often go over it with sort of a little kitchen sponge that's a little bit moist to help kind of level it out so I don't have to do quite as much, we'll call it sanding. Again, on another note, there are products on the market now that require less sanding when it comes to the drywall compound. So again, another option. What happens when we have some large drywall repairs? Again, as we can see over to the illustrations to the right in the photographs, what we have a large opening, which requires certainly, in most cases, enlarging the holes to enable looking into the wall cavity for pipes or wires, and certainly creating some backing or a larger piece of drywall to be attached for the repair. So again, cut a rectangular hole around the damaged drywall, insert some 1x2 or some blocking for backing and screw it into place, and insert the new piece of drywall to kind of fit into that opening. And again, apply some sticky back tape and certainly adding your drywall compound to cover the tape and fill that opening area. And again, some sanding and applying of primer paint when it comes to the finishing. How about painting or repainting? So when it comes to painting or repainting, generally the unit should already have hopefully a fresh paint finish. However, if repainting is required, consider the following. Certainly try and use no or low VOC, that's volatile organic compound type paint. Most paint products on the market usually are that type, so the VOC type, to minimize the emissions and off-gassing. Avoid using oil-based paints due to the off-gassing. And paint provides a hygienic washable surface. So never paint over mold. You should always make sure it's cleaned first and then certainly painted after it's been cleaned. And correct mold conditions first, certainly, and clean up the mold, prime and seal the surface first. When it comes to plumbing, generally review the plumbing system and consider the following. So when we take a look at the photographs on the right, we see a leak at a sink, and again, a leak in a crawl space. We can see that the actual beam and part of the floor joist system and some of the materials stored are getting water damaged in this particular crawl space. So watch for leaks or constant drips in the system. So again, check and become familiar with the location of the shutoff valves. So for example, in these particular images, we don't see any shutoff valves. Well, it probably requires that we may have to go back to the main shutoff for the water supply to the house in order to do any repairs. If it's wastewater, certainly water backups, be aware that it contains contaminated water. So make sure that you thoroughly clean the wastewater leaks because it's important. Use a disinfectant in that particular case if it's certainly wastewater. If it's simply possibly things such as dishwater, may not be too bad. But for other fixtures, for example, obviously things like a toilet certainly is very dirty wastewater. How about bath fixtures and cleaning? So we need to think about, again, from a tenant's perspective, the periodic cleaning is required for certainly issues as sinks, tubs, showers, and so on. So clean regularly for health reasons, and using the wrong cleaning product can possibly damage the finish depending on the type of finish. So many tubs and showers require at a minimal yearly scrubbing and care. Certainly more often is also recommended, but at least yearly. When it comes to cleaning, never use spray or leave-on cleaners. Lime removers, toilet bowl cleaners, aromatic solvents, abrasive cleaners, strong liquid cleaners, or other materials such as scouring pads that can damage the finish. Scratch surfaces become a place for the breeding ground for bacteria. So clean with a non-abrasive soap or a foam cleanser using a sponge or a soft cloth. What is recommended. When it comes to drain cleaning, certainly there will be times when you're going to possibly experience a blockage in the drain. So drain cleaning, basically plumbing clogs, are part of normal maintenance. Use of harsh drain cleaners is not recommended. If spilled, they can damage the finish of the fixture. Easier to use baking soda and vinegar on a slow drain and plug drains, as opposed to some of the more harmful chemicals that are available, certainly in the marketplace. And if the drain is still plugged, use an auger, or sometimes it's called the plumber's snake, to clear the blockage. So again, in the lower picture, we can see kind of a little illustration of the plumber's snake, again, snaking through and hopefully going to clear the blockage. How about caulking in wet areas? Certainly when it comes to wet areas such as bathrooms and even the kitchen, or perhaps even the laundry room, if there is one, caulking helps seal the wet areas and protects the adjacent surfaces. So caulking protects the walls and subfloors, particularly around bathtubs and showers, and certainly even around toilets. Moisture in drywall and wall cavities can cause mold to grow. So again, moisture and drywall, especially moisture and water that sits for a long period of time, is simply good food to help feed the mold growth. Moisture of wood subflooring can also cause mold, rot in the flooring, and cause damage. So the minor cost of caulking or caulking replacement can save thousands of dollars in repairs. So possibly a tube of caulking, maybe even some cheap caulking, is a couple bucks as opposed to maybe $5 or $6 for a tube of caulking. And so again, it's money well spent, and certainly it's going to help seal the condition. When we take a look again at the image, we can see here, this is a sign of the failure in the caulking. We see these open areas where it's either open areas in the caulking where it's beginning to fail, or in the case if it's actually sitting on the surface, it's likely mold growth starting to develop on the caulking itself. So again, when we talk about caulking for bathrooms, again, in the upper illustration, you'll see some orangey looking areas, lights, lines, where these are recommended areas for caulking to occur. So along the edges of the wall, around the tub, around the actual faucets and fixtures, the countertop at the vanity, near the sink there, and around the base of the toilet. So these are the application areas. So where bathtubs and showers meet the walls, tub surrounds, and floor, around the faucets, spigots, and shower head, and around the toilet base, and between a vanity countertop and wall. Looking at the lower photograph, however, we can see, again, towards the base of a toilet. Again, I would caulk most of the perimeter at the base, but I would leave the back portion open. Not only is it awkward to get to, but it's also an area where if there's going to be any leakage, at least the water or the waste, hopefully not the waste, but the contaminated water would have an opportunity to possibly leak out at the back. So it would be a place where you could look to make sure that there's not a leak on the toilet fixture itself. Again, part of the leak could also be the upper tank, which also might have water that's just simply leaking from some loose connections. Caulking baths and kitchens. So periodically inspect and review caulking is certainly any wet areas. So check for mold and mildew around the perimeter of the tub and the walls. I typically, as an inspector, would push against the wall material to see if there's movement. If there's a movement, it indicates it's a soft drywall, or the tiles may need to be replaced. Certainly, it's likely that there is going to be necessary to repair any damage. So clean and remove any mold, and remove the old caulking with a scraper and apply liquid silicone remover to get the last bit off. Again, in this photograph, we can see that in this particular case, the tub, we can see the open joint between the tile and the top of the tub here. That open joint needs to be caulked and sealed. Otherwise, water can get in behind and cause damage. Not so much to the tub because it's pretty durable, but to the finishes such as the uh, water-based gypsum board behind, whatever that backing is. Again, when it comes to applying caulking, some recommendations here. Make sure the surfaces to be caulked are clean and certainly dry. Recommend cut the tube at about a 90-degree angle and poke a metal coat hanger or long nail into the tube to break the foil seal, because quite often it will have a little foil seal and it may require just a little bit of opening there to get that caulking moving down through its little tube. Hold the caulking gun at 90 degrees to the seam being caulked and smooth the caulking bead with a wet finger. Often what I've done myself is, if it's a fairly wide joint that needs to be caulked, is simply I put a little bit of painter's masking tape on either side and simply fill in between. And when I let it dry, I eventually peel away the old, we'll call it masking tape, and I have a nice, beautiful caulked joint when it comes to caulking. Let's talk next about a little bit of plumbing, and certainly plumbing and freezing. Again, a home's plumbing system is the most vulnerable during the winter. The pipes most at risk are those in unheated interior spaces such as basements, attics, and garages, but also any that might exist in an outside exterior wall. So again, pipes in attics, pipes in basements, pipes in garages, or any exterior water lines. So again, we can see here the evidence of not just ice buildup on the pipe, but we can also see where through the expansion of the water as it freezes, it expands and will create these open joints, basically pipe breaks in the water line. Not a good thing, because it's going to certainly spell trouble. When it comes to electrical systems can become overloaded by having too many basically fixtures plugged into the same circuit. So what are some of the trouble spot areas to think about as a tenant? Certainly hair dryers, microwaves, coffee makers, toasters, and kettles all draw a lot of electrical power. Certainly use them, but if they're all used, for example, in the kitchen, such as a microwave, the coffee maker, the toaster, and the kettle, and God knows what else you might have as far as appliances, are all plugged in at the same time, there's a pretty good chance there's going to be a overload when it comes to the electrical circuit. The other thing, often electrical extension or power strips are installed that allows multiple connections. However, this can also contribute to overloading on electrical circuit. So just a little bit of background about the capacity when it comes to overloads. Certainly it's not for the faint at heart. It's more technical in nature here. But an overload occurs when the circuit is loaded with the connections that exceeds 1800 watts. Quite often you'll see on some of the appliances or fixtures, it'll indicate the power. So for example, in this case, 1800 watts. Well, an 1800 watt, just to give you an example, is a 15 amp breaker. And a 15 amp breaker in a house is a fairly common breaker that you would find hopefully in your electrical service panel. So this is what it will handle. But in a kitchen, for example, it's probably recommended, because of the amount of appliances, that it actually should be a 20 amp breaker or can handle 2400 watts. So again, I don't want to run through the whole example here, but a bathroom has a fan, an outlet, and a light. The maximum circuit load is 1800 watts. But what happens when you plug in the 1800 watt hairdryer? Well, with all the other, it's already at an overload condition now, once we plug in that 1800 watt hairdryer. So again, the message here is it's going to trip the breaker and certainly create the overload. Now imagine the same thing happening in the kitchen, as I indicated, with the number of appliances that possibly could be utilized plugged into the kitchen. When it comes to extension cords, we have to think about the electrical extension cord. Certainly can be a convenience, but it can also be problematic, because often they oppose the opportunity to overload the electrical circuit. It can also present the potential of a fire hazard. So a few of the things to think about when it comes to extension cords, is it the wrong gauge wire size for the connection? Is it ungrounded, 2-prong versus a 3-prong? And connecting too many devices is a potential for overheating. Again, when we take a look at the photograph here, we can see these 2 power strips. Again, imagine these 2 are just plugged into 2 electrical receptacles, on the same electrical receptacle. What was intended to be only 2 originally, we now have how many more? We can see here quite a bit more that simply is plugged into the extension cords. So again, the potential here for overloading or the potential of possibly overheating. Again, when I look at the cords, look at the color to see if there's any brownish looking marks, signs of overheating. Or go back to the electrical receptacle itself and see if there's any signs, discoloration, that might be a sign of indicating of overheating. Let's talk about light bulbs. John talked earlier about things such as there probably will be times in the life and I guess a duration that tenants in a home that light bulbs will need to be replaced. So things about changing and replacing light bulbs. So again, just from a safety point of view, turn off the power at the switch. Use a ladder if it's required. And you may need protective gloves if the light bulbs are simply too hot to handle. Gently remove the bulb, typically simply by unscrewing it from the light socket, and replace with a new light bulb. And then once it's installed, turn the power back on or switch it back on to check the operation. Again, over to the right-hand side, I've indicated that nowadays, although these bulbs can tend to be much more expensive than your traditional tungsten type bulbs, the best type of bulbs for longevity, and certainly we'll call it even for the cost factor over time, is to go and consider LED. So as you can see, the estimated energy cost per year, when we take a look at the lumens is indicated there. So again, using a 7-watt or 14-watt or 20-watt bulb, remember we talked about the 1800 watts? Looks like you could have a lot of light bulbs, we'll call it connected, not really, but certainly it's going to save a lot of power and energy when it comes to a cost point of view of energy bills if you're paying certainly your utility bills. So again, think about light bulbs. On the electrical side again, I want to talk a little bit about GFCIs and AFCIs. So the ground fault circuit interrupter and the arc fault circuit interrupter, they're really 2 electrical safety devices. They help prevent electrocution, they help prevent electric fire, they stop electricity in damp environments such as wet conditions, such as a bathroom, or perhaps in a garage, or even on the outside of a house. The AFCI, the arc fault protection, is installed in the primary electrical service panel. So in the lower image, we can see this is a breaker that would be installed into the electric service panel. And the arc fault, as the name implies, it's about arc protection. So for example, in the winter sometimes you might scuff your feet and you get that little zap when you touch something that's metallic. That's an arc that is happening. Now imagine that in a number of different conditions within a house. So an arc fault certainly can happen when it comes to electrical. So AFCIs detect this arcing in electricity, then shuts down the outlets before any serious damage occurs. Likewise, when it comes to the ground fault, again, typically, I most often will see them in bathrooms, is it can detect really a fractional milliamp of electric current. So for example, if my fingers were wet enough, it's going to simply trip and protect me from getting a shock. So as we can see, there's a reset button on the top and a test button, in this case, on the bottom. They're not always red, sometimes they're white, or they might be different colors. But they're simply look for the test button. And again, testing doesn't hurt because you push the reset button to reset it back to normal operation. So again, the ground fault and arc faults are things to look at, safety devices when it comes to electrical in a house. Let's talk a little bit about the heating side of things. So when it comes to heating, certainly there are a number of different types of heating systems available. The ones I've portrayed here simply is the forced air furnace. Now I know it's not going to be available in all areas, but the most common heating system in Canada is the forced air furnace. So a few things to think about is check the thermostat for various functions. So for example, heating, cooling, or simply just air circulation. Check and replace the furnace filters every month or two. And clean the registers and grills at least once per year, perhaps more often. If you see dirt or grime accumulate, certainly they should be cleaned. So when we take a look again at the photograph, I've removed the upper, we'll call it service panel, looking at this particular forced air furnace. In fact, this is the one in my house. So I can see all the different components and conditions. In the lower service panel is what they call the blower motor, which is a main motor that's going to distribute the air heated or in some cases air conditioned through a house. And over to the dark area in between, you'll see another little box. That's an electronic air cleaner. Typically, I don't use it now, but there's also a filter place in between. So this is where we're going to talk about filters. And of course, the ductwork over to the right-hand side is return air duct on this particular furnace. Again, look at the grills and make sure that they're reasonably clean. Otherwise, we're just helping to circulate more dust and we'll call it air contaminants through the house. So again, moving over to furnace filters. So changing your furnace filter is one way to keep things running smoothly and efficiently and keeping the air reasonably clean in your house. It's not going to pick up everything, but it can also help conserve energy when it comes to the efficiency of the heating and or in some cases the cooling in the house. Besides, a clean filter can help maximize the amount of heat or cooling. So if you want to maximize it, make sure that the filters are reasonably clean. It increases the furnace's lifespan, longevity of the furnace. It certainly can help improve indoor air quality, and it certainly reduces the likelihood of, we'll call it, repairs. And it certainly keeps the furnace in the home cleaner. So again, you can have a number of different types of filters, so you would have to open and take a look at what type of filter is on your furnace. And this one we see here in this image is simply one with a sort of a cardboard frame. Some have metal or in some cases even plastic frames. And we can see that the pleated filter itself, once it starts to get not so looking whitish, but getting sort of this grayish or darkish color, it's certainly done its duty and it's time for a change. Time to replace that filter. You can take a look at the size. This is a 16 by 25 by 1 inch. And certainly if you go to your local hardware or we'll call it supply place, you can probably find these fairly readily. Again, on the heating side of things, thermostats. What do you need to know about thermostats? Well, a thermostat's a dial which is set to the required temperature and has an input of the actual temperature in the house, and which operates as a switch simply that gives an output electrical signal back to the furnace, so it's either on or off, or it's going to operate at a certain temperature. So requiring, for example, in this case, it's set for 72 degrees Fahrenheit. So if it was, let's say 70 degrees Fahrenheit, as far as the temperature in the house, the furnace is going to click on and try and make up and build back up to the 72 degrees of required temperature that you have basically required. So it's basically a temperature sensor with a switch and a memory to set to the desired temperature. Again, if we take a look at the actual thermostat image itself, you'll see there's a cool setting, an off, a heat, a fan on, so you could have the fan running constantly, even when it's a non-heating time of the year. So you have constant air movement through your furnace to help air circulation. I usually recommend that because with the air movement, it helps reduce moisture buildup in a house, but circulating air in a house also reduces the likelihood of mold buildup in a house. or it can be set to the automatic setting. So again, this is just one type of many types of thermostats. Certainly, there are a lot of different ones on the market. HRVs and ERVs, heat recovery and energy recovery ventilators. They're often forgotten. In fact, I've been in some houses where some people really don't know what this thing is. So again, maintenance of these are really important. Again, they're part of the heat recovery and to help create energy efficiency in the heating system of a house. So first off, when it comes to basically looking at it to making sure it needs cleaning or not, it's simply there's a switch on the side most often of that life breath box, the picture on the upper right. So turn it off or in some cases, if necessary, unplug it. So clean or replace the air filters. So clean your filters at least every 2 months. Check outdoor intake and exhaust hoods. So connected to this on the outside, there's going to be 2 particular exhaust hoods. Well, actually one's an intake hood, the other is the exhaust hoods. Check to see if your HRV has a condensate drain, because mostly what it's going to do is at some times of the year is there will be condensate collected. So usually there's what's called a drip pan in the bottom of this box, the heat recovery or ERV box, and it's going to simply drip away, hopefully to a drain. So you want to clean the heat exchanger core, and actually it's not a hard, difficult thing to do. Simply when we take a look at the image on the lower right, that gray looking box that I'm pointing to slides out. It's simply in some tracks that hold it in place, and I can wash it or kind of check it and make sure that it's not dirty. And again, if you do this several times a year, you're in great condition. You are maintaining your HRV or your ERV. Now, one thing you have to do is make sure that before you reactivate the HRV or ERV is that certainly the core has been after washing and cleaning, that it's dry. There's a little a motor inside. Certainly usually doesn't require too much as far as maintenance is concerned. So the main thing is making sure that this filter heat exchanger core is clean periodically. And if required, certainly service the fan if you hear some sort of, we'll call it, some noises that just seem that it's a little bit off kilter. When we take a look at the upper picture, you can see there's the door in the front, and it simply drops down. It's on 2 hinges up towards the bottom, has 2 latches at the top to open it. So you can see in the lower image where I've got the door, and again, this is my HRV in my house, taking a look at the actual components inside. It's a very simple box, very simple to clean and maintain. Let's talk about appliances. Certainly appliances in general require periodic maintenance and cleaning. So refrigerator, in my mind, is a key appliance for preserving food. When we look at the range, oven or cooktop is the main cooking appliance. And certainly things we need to think about is avoiding grease or food buildup on surfaces. As we saw earlier, we saw an image of a kitchen that looked a little grimy and dirty and certainly needs some serious cleaning. So again, it's better to be proactive and do this on a very regular basis, and certainly only use appliances only for their intended use. I know in some instances we often hear that maybe people are using their stove as the backup secondary heating system to add heat. Certainly avoid that, because we don't want to, again, jeopardize an opportunity for a fire to occur, especially in a kitchen. How about a little bit on the topic of life safety? Certainly things such as smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors can save lives. So when we look at it, smoke detectors usually are located in the hallway between the bedrooms and the kitchen. Ideally, the best coverage for smoke detectors should be installed in all bedrooms and all sleeping areas. So that's the ideal condition, but at a minimum, there should at least be one in the hallway, in between the kitchen and going the hallway to the bedroom. On the other side, we have the CO or carbon monoxide detector. They're generally an electrical plug-in type and detect carbon monoxide. So when it comes to fuel burning appliances in any house, we really want to be able to detect carbon monoxide buildup in a home. These detectors generally have test buttons, and certainly they should be tested periodically just to see that they are working. So if it's a battery type, change the batteries at least twice a year. What I typically would recommend, think about it from a seasonal perspective. First day of spring, first day of fall, or you choose the other seasons that you would prefer. Again, when we take a look at the image, that's a pot light over to the right, but certainly this is a wired ceiling mounted smoke detector in my house. Again, when it comes to smoke detectors, they typically should be changed about every 10 years. So again, easily replaced, a couple of screws to undo it, and certainly a couple of screws to replace it. But certainly there's some electrical wiring if they're hardwired. In other words, they're part of the electrical system. The hardwired ones are good because unless there's a power outage, they're always operating. So they're always live and working. We don't have to worry about changing batteries. Again, when it comes to smoke and carbon monoxide, they're an important part of safety in a home. These fire protections direct wire devices will automatically detect and warn you of the presence of smoke, and certainly can save your life and life of anyone in the family in the event of a fire. The only reliable way to detect a carbon monoxide leak is with a carbon monoxide alarm. If the home does not have a carbon monoxide detector, certainly you may be at a serious risk of experiencing carbon monoxide poisoning. And of course, in worst case scenarios, not often, but occasionally we'll hear about it has also caused the death in a family. Again, this one here is the carbon monoxide detector on the bottom, and it shows the parts per million of carbon monoxide buildup in a house. So again, they will usually have an alarm which will scream at you when it comes to it's reached the, we'll call it the potential target of detecting the carbon monoxide in a house. So here's a few other considerations. Some examples of additional terms and conditions include, certainly getting back to what John was saying earlier, is perhaps a prohibition of pets. Are pets allowed or not? Certainly, there may be certain activities such as smoking or cultivation of cannabis. John mentioned perhaps there are some insurance requirements, and certainly, are you, the tenant, responsible to pay for utilities, or is it included? And certainly, there may be some, we'll call it rules or regulations or restrictions regarding sublet arrangements when it comes to tenants. Getting towards the end here, emergency repair. So what happens if there's an emergency? So again, thank you, CMHC, for offering this. We can see what is considered an emergency repair and what is a non-emergency repair. So again, this sort of, we'll call it list or chart, helps indicate some of the issues. So for example, broken pipes are flooding the premises, or the refrigerator supplied by the landlord isn't working. Is it, these things are emergency repairs as opposed to some of the non-emergency repair. An interior door doesn't close properly, non-emergency. There's a minor leak or dripping in the household plumbing. Is it non-emergency? Certainly these things need to be taken care of. But again, just sort of differentiating between an emergency repair or the non-emergency repair. Another thing we might want to consider, again, is maintenance exchange. So maintenance exchange for reduced rent. Perhaps if there's some financial hardships, there may be some other ways of looking at rent as opposed to not paying rent. So depending on the amount of additional responsibility the tenant is taking on, perhaps consider if you can negotiate to reduce a tenant's rent by a certain amount. So again, if you're part of the leasehold team or renting team, as opposed to the tenant, is this something that may be entertained? And as it indicates here, since rent is often due at the beginning of the month, perhaps one way of tracking this, if it's going to be allowed or permitted, is perhaps using that as a credit towards the next month's rent. So again, in good faith, if the tenant has done the work, the next month they get a reduction in the rent. So again, it's just a thought. It doesn't necessarily mean that it applies to all and every circumstance. So John, did you want to kind of close off there?
Yeah, just two questions that I believe would be asked. So one would be regarding the tripping of electrical outlets. So generally, if you have a blow dryer and an iron on the same outlet or line, there's a good chance you're going to possibly trip your fuse box, correct?
Yes. Yes,
And
that is.
go ahead.
Yeah, yes, that is correct. It's going to likely trip the breaker. And if you go down to, well, go down to or to the electrical service panel, you should see that there's sort of an on position and an off position for the breakers. Often when it trips, it'll be sitting in the middle. In order for it to be reactivated, you actually have to flip it all the way to the off position and then back to the on position for it to reactivate.
Yeah, and that's a common problem for, any household is overloading your, again, another combination would be a vacuum cleaner and a blow dryer or an iron. Appliances that are heavy wattage usage, correct? And
That's right. Often, you don't always have the choice when it comes to something like a hair dryer of getting the we'll say the one with the least amount of electrical energy being used, because certainly there's a cost factor,
yeah,
or you simply that is what you have, and that's what you're going to be using. But I guess in a case like that, what you have to be careful of is not operating both at the same time. So again, it's just sort of we'll call it due diligence when it comes to making sure that you avoid the tripping, because most houses are pretty much designed these days or in the operating condition that it's either usually on, as I indicated, a 15 amp breaker, or in the case of a kitchen, a 20 amp breaker. And certainly the amperage gets greater if it's a stove. It could be possibly a 30 or 40 amp breaker, because those really draw a lot of electrical power. But again, getting back to your sort of bathroom scenario of a hair dryer and a curling iron, yeah, the potential for tripping is fairly high, uh, certainly in the bathroom.
yes. The other question that generally comes up is furnace filters. So when you take possession of your house, there's a furnace filter in there. And my suggestion would be is to with your camera, take a picture of the side for the exact measurement, because there's furnace filters, and there's furnace filters. So
Yeah.
to not get confused, take a picture of that, and you're going to have to budget accordingly. So a furnace filter, a really high end one, which you would want if you go cheap to get cheap. You want if there's they cost around $40 for maybe two. You can get them at Canadian Tire. They go on sale periodically. If you're at Costco, you can buy them in bulk. You can also buy them online at for example, furnacefilters.ca. I actually buy a couple of my humidity filters from these guys. So you're going to have to budget, and you're going to have to spend, approximately 40, 80, about $100 a year on furnace filters, which is your responsibility. And if you go cheap, you get cheap. Now, I know in some cases people will take a bounce sheet and put it over the filters. And I don't know what your thoughts on that, Claude, is putting a bounce filter over or filter air vent filters. What are your thoughts on those?
Well, the moment that you're actually putting something like a covering over anything when it comes to airflow, you're reducing the airflow which is going to reduce the amount of heat getting through the system. So for example, let's say that you're trying to cover over and put a cleaner layer onto an existing furnace filter. Really what you're redoing is you're reducing airflow, which and actually what it's going to do is going to tax the furnace to try and work harder to make up that 72 degrees Fahrenheit of heat that you're requiring, that you set on your thermostat. So it's going to be more, we'll call it wear and tear uh, on the furnace itself. So it's not a good idea. It certainly sounds like it should be a good idea to put a little bounce fabric sheet over top of, let's say, a return air. But again, in another way, you're actually blocking the amount of return air coming through that particular register. So,
Right.
so I first off, I wouldn't recommend it.
Now, the third question is when you become a tenant, obviously you have to budget. And I guess budgeting for your home, again, as we talked earlier, housing is not free. And so there has to pay. And I guess the equivalent is housing is like a vehicle you own. You have to do maintenance, you have to change the oil. Like the chief of council doesn't change your oil in your vehicle. They don't put gas in your vehicle. They don't pay for your insurance. You have to do your monthly repairs to the bank for your vehicle. So your vehicle it's the same thing as your home. You have to make those payments, and it's important to make those payments because then the money goes to the council, and if they need to, for example, replace the water tank or repair the roof, they have the money through their rent that they can use to reinvest back into the community. So a good paying tenant is a healthy community because it helps to cover the cost for repairs. So, but budgeting is extremely important. And if you have, problems about budgeting, there are a number of courses online for basic budgeting, or you should talk maybe with the council to have somebody come in and talk about financial literacy, which is extremely important and applies to everybody. My friends, your friends, budgeting is extremely important, especially when it comes to owning vehicles and renting properties. So
Yeah, I agree, John. Certainly, budgeting is an important part as even as a tenant to consider that there will be some costs, obviously, for maintenance. So, like you indicated, you can buy a $10 filter for a furnace or spend $40 and certainly get a superior furnace filter. Um, Light bulbs. We can certainly pick up a light bulb for a couple bucks, or we can spend one that's $5 or $7 and get something that'll last 4 times longer than the one that you paid as we'll call it the cheaper version for lighting, and certainly even the quality of lighting these days, if you think about it, when it comes to even light bulb replacement, is again, you have to think about those things as part of your budget. Um, there's always going to be some maintenance to certain degrees, depending on the condition of the house to begin with.
yeah, and depending where you're located in the community, Home Hardware, Canadian Tire, Flyers, they always these items that we use daily, cleaning supplies. If you're a smart shopper, you can get many of these devices. If you're not in a rush, you can get them on sale and a huge sale, especially LED light bulbs, like for $2, which are normally $20, because they have sometimes a coupon. So smart shopping, being a smart tenant, will also save you money, especially if you're not in a rush for items. If you need it immediately, then you're going to pay full price. But if you can wait and plan, then you can, save yourself money. So before we go, there's free repair guides on our FNNBOA website. So you can go to our site, www.FNNBOA.ca. And there's also various other toolkit guides online. And if you have any follow-up questions, I would suggest to contact the housing department, chief and council, and your housing professional manager, or you can contact us at info@finboa.ca. And if you have any questions or follow-up, you can send them to us by email and we'll try to answer them for you. So thank you, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you.
End recording.